Hello, everyone. Let's continue on with A Thousand Boy Kisses by Tillie Cole. Mr. Litchfield sighed and ran his hand over his face. He sat back against the bench. When you came back to Blossom Grove, Rune, I took one look at you and couldn't believe how you'd changed. I felt disappointed, he admitted. I felt my chest tighten at that blow. He shook his head. I saw the smoking, the attitude, and assumed you bore no resemblance to the boy you were before. The one that loved my daughter as much as she loved him. The boy that I would have bet my life would have walked through fire for my baby girl. But who you are now, I never would have expected you to love her in the way that she deserves. Mr. Litchfield's voice grew husky with pain. Clearing his throat, he said, I fought against you when I saw how you two had connected again. I tried to warn her off, but you two have always been like magnets, drawn together by some unknown force. He huffed a laugh. Poppy's mamma said that you were both to trust together for a greater meaning, one we would never know until it presented itself. She said that great loves were always destined to be together for some great reason. He paused and turning to me, stated, and now I know. I looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Litchfield's firm hand landed on my shoulder. You were meant to be together, so you could be here her guiding light through all of this. You were created perfectly for her, to make this time for my girl special, to make sure her remaining days were filled with things her mamma and I could never have given her. Pain sliced through me, and I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, Mr. Litchfield dropped his hand, but made me face him still. Ruin, I was against you, but I could see how much she loved you. I just wasn't sure you loved her back. I do, I said honestly. I never stopped. He nodded his head. I didn't know until the trip to New York. I didn't want her to go. He inhaled and said, but when she came back, I could see that there was a new peace within her. Then she told me what you did for her. Carnegie Hall. He shook his head. You gave my girl her biggest dream, for no other reason than you wanted her to achieve it, to make her happy, because you loved her. She gives me more, I replied, and bowed my head. Just by being her, she gives me that tenfold. Rune, if Poppy comes out of this, when, I interrupted, when she comes out of this. I lifted my head to see Mr. Litchfield looking at me. When, he said with a hopeful sigh, I won't stand in your way. He leaned forward to rest his face on his hands. She was never right after you left, Rune. I know you struggled with not having her in your life, and I'd had to be a fool not to see that you blame your papa for all of this, for leaving. But sometimes life doesn't go the way you expect. I never expected to lose my daughter before I left. But Poppy has taught me that I can't be angry because, son, he said, and looked me in the face. If Poppy isn't angry about having a short life, how dare any of us be angry for her? I stared back silently. My heart beat faster as words. Images of Poppy twirling in the blossom grove filled my mind. Her smile wide as she breathed in the scented air. I saw the same smile as I remembered her dancing in the shallow water at the beach, her hands in the air as the sun kissed her face. Poppy was happy, even with this diagnosis, even with all the pain and disappointment of her treatment, she was happy. I'm glad you returned, son. You're making Poppy's final days, in her words, as special can be. Mr. Litchfield got to his feet. In a move I'd only ever seen from his daughter, Poppy, he tipped his face to the setting sun and closed his eyes. When he brought his head back down, he walked back toward the door, looking back to say, You're welcome here as much as you like, Rune. I think with you by her side, Poppy will come out of this. She'll come out of this just so she can spend a few extra days with you. I saw that look in her eyes as she lay on that bed. She isn't going anywhere just yet. You know as well as I do. If she's determined to see something through, then she'll damn well see it through. My lips lifted into a small smile. Mr. Litchfield left me alone in the garden. Reaching into my pockets, I pulled my wow. I put my smokes. As I went to light the end, I stopped. As Poppy's smile filled my head, her disapproving scrunched nose every time I smoked, I pulled a cigarette from my mouth and threw it to the ground. Enough, I said aloud. No more. Taking a long breath of the fresh air, I got to my feet and went back inside. As I entered the family room, Poppy's family was sitting on one side and on the other. My mama, papa, and Alton. As soon as my baby brother saw me, he lifted his head and waved. Doing what Poppy would have wanted me to do, I sat down beside him. Hey, buddy, I said, and almost lost it when he crawled onto my lap and pushed his arms around my neck. I felt Alton's back shaking. When he pulled back his head, his cheeks were wet. Is Poppy been sick? Clearing my throat, I nodded. His bottom lip wobbled. But you love her, he whispered, cracking my heart in the process. I nodded again, and he laid his head against my chest. I don't want Poppyman to go anywhere. She made you speak to me. She made you be best friends with me, he sniffed. I don't want you to be angry again. I felt each of his words like a dagger into my chest. But those daggers only let in light when I thought of how Poppy had got at me to Alton. I thought of how disappointed she'd be if I ignored him now. Holding Alton closer, I whispered, I won't ignore you again, buddy, I promise. Alton lifted his head and wiped at his eyes. When he raked his hair back, I couldn't help but smirk. Alton smiled in reply and hugged me tighter. He didn't let go of me until the doctor entered the room. He told us we could go in and see her 2 at a time. Mr. and Mrs. Litchfield went in first. Then it was my turn. I pushed through the door and froze in my tracks. Poppy lay in the bed in the middle of the room. Machines were hooked up all around her. My heart cracked. She looked so broken lying there, so quiet. No laughter or smiles on her face. I walked forward and sat down on the chair beside her. Taking hold of her hand, I brought it to my lips and pressed down a kiss. I couldn't stand the silence, so I began to tell Poppy about the first time I kissed her. I told her about every kiss I could remember since we were 8. How they felt, how she made me feel. Knowing that if she could hear me, she'd love every word of what I had to say. Reliving every single kiss that she held so dear, all 902 that we'd achieved so far, and 98 we'd still collect. When she woke up, because she would, we had a vow to fulfill. From the perspective of Rune, 1 week later. Hey, Rune. I looked up from the paper I was writing to see Jory at the door to Poppy's room. Judson, Deacon, and Ruby were standing behind her in the hallway. I flicked my chin in their direction, and they all walked in. Poppy was still in her bed, still in her coma. After a few days, the doctors had said the worst of her infection had passed, and other visitors had been allowed in. My Poppy had done it. Just as she promised, she fought to keep the infection from taking her down. I knew she would. She had held my hand when she made that promise. She met my eyes. It was as good as done. The doctors were planning on bringing her slowly out of her coma over the next few days. They were going to gradually lessen the dosage of anesthetic beginning later tonight, and I couldn't wait. This week had felt like an eternity without her. Everything felt wrong and out of place. So much had changed in my world by her being gone, yet by contrast, nothing on the outside really had. The only real development was that the entire school now knew that Poppy didn't have much time left. From what I heard, they were all predictably shocked. Everyone was sad. We had been at school with most of these people since kindergarten. Although they didn't know Poppy like our small group of friends did, it had still rocked the town. People from her church had gathered to pray for her, to show their love. I knew if Poppy knew about it, it would warm her heart. The doctors weren't sure how strong she would be when she woke up. They were reluctant to estimate how long she had left, but her doctor told us this infection had severely weakened her. He told us we had to be prepared. When she finally woke up, we could be facing only weeks. As much as that blow hurt, as much as it tore my heart from my chest, I tried to take joy in the small victories. I would have weeks to help fulfill Poppy's final wishes. I would have the time I needed to truly say goodbye, to hear her laugh, see her smile, and kiss her soft lips. Jory and Ruby entered the room first, going to the opposite side of the bed to where I sat to squeeze Poppy's hand. Deacon and Judson stopped beside me, laying their hands on my shoulder in support. The minute word had spread about Poppy, my friends had cut school to come see me. As soon as I laid eyes on them rushing through the hallway, I knew that everyone knew. I knew that they knew. They'd been by my side ever since. They were upset that Poppy and I hadn't said a thing to any of them except for Joy. But in the end, they understood why Poppy didn't want a fuss. I think they loved her even more for that. They saw her true strength. Over the past week, when I hadn't been in school, it was my friends who had brought my assignments from my teachers. They had looked out for me, as I had done for Poppy. Deacon and Judson said they were determined I didn't flunk out when we'd all reached our senior year together. It was the first thing from my mind, but I appreciated their concern. In fact, this week showed me how much they meant to me. Even though Poppy was my entire life, I realized that I had love everywhere else. I had friends who would walk through fire for me. My mama also came every day, as did my papa. He didn't seem to care that I mostly ignored him. He didn't seem to care if we sat in silence. I thought he only cared that he was here, that he was beside me. I wasn't sure what to do with that yet. Joy looked up, catching my eye. How is she today? I rose from my chair and sat on the edge of Poppy's bed. I linked her fingers through mine and held on tight, leaning forward. I brushed the hair back from her face and kissed her on her forehead. She's getting stronger each day, I said softly, and then for Poppy's ears only, I whispered, Our friends are here, baby. They've come to see you again. My heart lurched when I thought I saw the flickering of her lashes, but when I stared longer, I realized it must have been my imagination. I'd been desperate to see her again for too many hours to count. Then I relaxed, knowing that, over the next few days, seeing these things wouldn't simply be in my imagination, they'd be real. My friend sat down on the couch near the large window. The doctors have decided to start gradually bringing her out of her coma tonight, I said. It might take a couple of days for her to be fully conscious, but bringing her around slowly is what they believe is best. Her immune system has strengthened as much as they think it will. The infection has gone. She's all ready to come back to us. I exhaled and added quietly. Finally, I'll finally be able to see her eyes again. That's good, Rue, Joy replied and gave me a weak smile. There was an expectant silence. My friends all glanced at each other. What? I asked, trying to read their faces. It was Ruby who replied. What will she be like when she wakes? My stomach tightened. Weak, I whispered. Turning back to Poppy, I stroked down her cheek. But she'll be here again. I don't care if I have to carry her everywhere we go. I just want to see her smile. I'll have her back with me, where she belongs, at least for a little while. I heard a sniff and saw Ruby crying. Joy held her close. I sighed in sympathy, but said, I know you love her, Ruby, but when she wakes, when she finds out everyone knows, act normal. She hates seeing those she loves upset. It's the worst part of all of this for her. I squeeze Poppy's fingers. When she wakes, we need to make her happy, like she does everyone else. We can't show her that we're sad. Ruby nodded her head, then asked, She won't ever be coming back to school again, will she? I shook my head. Neither will I, not until, I trailed off, unwilling to finish off with those words. I wasn't ready to say them yet. I wasn't ready to face all of this. Not yet. Rune, Deacon said, a serious tone to his voice. What are you doing next year for college? Have you even applied anywhere? He wrung his hands together. You've got me concerned. We're all leaving, and you haven't even mentioned a thing. We're just real worried. I'm not even thinking that far ahead, I replied. My life is here for right now, in this moment. All that will come later. Poppy's my focus. She's only ever been my focus. I don't give a damn about next year or what I'll do. A silence descended on the room. I saw in Deacon's face that he wanted to say more, but he didn't dare. Will she make prom? My heart sank as Joy gazed sadly at her best friend. I don't know, I replied. She wanted to, so badly, but it's still 6 weeks out. The doctors just don't know. I turned to look at Joy. It was one of her last wishes to go to her senior prom. I swallowed and turned back to Poppy. In the end, all she wants to do is to be kissed and see a prom. That's all she's asking for. Nothing grand, nothing life-changing. Just those things with me. I gave my friends a moment, as Joy and Ruby began to cry quietly, but I didn't break. I just silently counted down the hours until she came back to me, imagining the moment I would see her smile once more, look up at me, squeeze my hands in hers. After an hour or so, my friend stood up. Judson dropped papers on the small table beside Poppy's bed that I used as a desk. Math and geography, men. The teachers wrote everything on there for you, hand-in dates and such. I stood and said goodbye to my friends, thanking them for coming. When they left, I moved to the table to complete the homework. I'd finish this work, then take my camera outside, my camera, which I hadn't removed from my neck in weeks. The camera that was a part of me again. Hours must have passed as I ducked in and out of the room, capturing the day outside. Later that evening, Poppy's family began filling into the room, Poppy's doctors following closely behind. I jumped from my seat and rubbed the tiredness from my eyes. They had arrived to begin bringing her out from the coma. Rune, Mr. Litchfield greeted. He walked over to where I was standing and embraced me. A happy truce had settled between us since Poppy had been in her coma. He understood me, and I understood him. Because of that, even Savannah had begun to trust me with not breaking her sister's heart. And because I hadn't left, not once, since Poppy had been admitted, if Poppy was here, so was I. My dedication must have showed that I love her more than any of them had ever believed. Ada came over to where I stood and wrapped her arms around my waist. Mrs. Litchfield kissed me on my cheek. Then we all waited for the doctor to finish his exam. When he turned to us, he said, Poppy's white blood cell count is as good as we can hope for in this stage of her illness. We'll gradually reduce the anesthetic and bring her around. As she gets stronger, we'll be able to unhook her from some of these machines. My heart beat fast, my hands clenching at my sides. Now, the doctor has continued, Poppy at first will slip in and out of consciousness. When she is conscious, she may be delirious, out of sorts. That will be from the medication still in her system. But eventually, she should begin to rouse for longer periods of time and, all being well, in a couple of days show us her usual happy self. The doctor held up his hands, but Poppy will be weak. Until we assess her in her conscious state, we won't be able to determine just how much this infection has weakened her. Only time will tell. But she may have limited movement, that restricts the things she can do. It is unlikely that she will regain full strength. I closed my eyes, praying to God that she would be okay, and if she wasn't, I promised that I would help her through. Anything to give me just a little more time. No matter what it took, I'd do everything. The next couple of days dragged by. Poppy's hands began to move slightly. Her eyelashes fluttered, and on day 2, her eyes began to open. It was only for a few seconds at a time, but it was enough to fill me with a mixture of excitement and hope. On day 3, a team of doctors and nurses came into the room and began the process of unhooking Poppy from the machines. I watched, her heart pounding, as the breathing tube was removed from her throat. I watched as machine after machine was carted away until I saw my girl again. My heart swelled. Her skin was pale, her usually soft lips were chapped, but seeing her free from all those machines, I was sure she'd never looked so perfect to me. I sat patiently in the chair by her bed, holding her hand in mine. My head was tipped back as I stared in a trance at the ceiling. When I felt Poppy's hand weakly squeezing mine, my breathing paused, my lungs froze. My eyes darted to Poppy on the bed. Her fingers on her free hand moved, softly twitching. Reaching over to the wall, I slammed the call button for the nurses. When one entered, I said, "I think she's waking up." Poppy had made slight movements over the past 24 hours, but never this many and for this long. "I'll get the doctor," she replied, and left the room. Poppy's parents came rushing in shortly after, having just arrived for their daily visit. The doctor entered seconds later. As he approached the bed, I stepped back to stand beside Poppy's parents, letting the assisting nurse check her vitals. Poppy's eyes began to flutter under her lids, then they slowly rolled open. I inhaled as her green eyes sleepily took in her surroundings. "Poppy? Poppy, you're okay," the doctor said soothingly. I saw Poppy try to turn her head in his direction, but her eyes couldn't focus. I felt a tug somewhere inside me when her hand reached out. She was searching for me. Even in a confused state, she was searching for my hand. "Poppy, you've been asleep for a while. You're okay, but you're going to feel tired. Just know that you're okay." Poppy made a sound like she was trying to speak. The doctor turned to the nurse. "Get her some ice for her lips." I couldn't stay back any longer, and I rushed forward, ignoring Mr. Litchfield's call for me to stop. Moving to the other side of the bed, I leaned down and wrapped my hand around Poppy's. The minute I did, her body calmed and her head softly rolled in my direction. Her eyes fluttered open. Then she looked right at me. "Hey, Poppy," I whispered, fighting the tightness in my throat. And then she smiled. It was small, barely a trace, but it was there. Her weak fingers squeezed mine with all the strength of a fly. Then she slipped back to sleep. I blew out a long breath, but Poppy's hand never released mine, so I stayed where I was. Sitting on the chair beside her, I stayed exactly where I was. Another day passed with an increasing number of moments of consciousness from Poppy. She wasn't really lucid when she was awake, but she smiled at me when she focused her attention my way. I knew a part of her, although confused, was aware I was here with her. Her weak smiles made sure there was nowhere else I'd ever be. Later that day, when a nurse came into the room to do her hourly checks, I asked, "Can I move her bed?" The nurse stopped what she was doing and raised her brow. "To where, darling?" I walked to the wide window. "Here," I said, "so when she wakes properly, she can see outside." I huffed a quiet laugh. "She loves to watch the sunrise." I glanced back. "Now she's not hooked up to anything but her IV. I thought it might be okay." The nurse stared at me. I could see the sympathy in her eyes. I didn't want her sympathy. I just wanted her to help me. I wanted her to help me give this to Poppy. "Sure," she said eventually. "I can't see that being a problem." My body relaxed. I moved to the side of Poppy's bed, the nurse at the other, and we rolled it to sit in front of the view of the pediatric oncology garden outside. a garden which sat under a clear blue sky. "This okay?" the nurse asked and pushed the brakes down. "Perfect," I replied and smiled. When Poppy's family came in a short time later, her mamma hugged me. "She'll love it," she said. As we sat around the bed, Poppy stirred from time to time, shifting where she lay, but for no longer than a few seconds. Over the past couple of days, her parents had taken turns staying overnight in the family room across the hallway. One stayed at home with the girls. More often than not, it was her mama who stayed here. I stayed in Poppy's room. I lay beside her in her small bed every night, slept with her in my arms, waiting for the moment she woke up. I knew her parents weren't exactly thrilled with it, but I figured they allowed it because why not? They wouldn't disallow it, not now, not in this circumstance. And I sure as hell wasn't leaving. Poppy's mama was talking to her sleeping daughter about her sisters. She was telling her about how they were doing at school, mundane things. I sat, half listening, when there was a soft knock at the door. When I glanced up, I saw my papa open the door. He gave Mrs. Litchfield a small wave, then looked at me. "Ruin, can I see you for a second?" I tensed, my eyebrows pulling into a frown. My papa waited by the door, never breaking our stare. Blowing out a breath, I rose from my seat. My papa backed away from the door as I approached. As I left the room, I saw he held something in his hand. He rocked on his feet nervously. "I know you didn't ask me to, but I developed your films for you." I froze. "I know you asked me to take them home, but I've seen you, Rune. I've watched you take these photographs, and I know they're for Poppy." He shrugged. "Now Poppy's waking up more and more. I thought you might want to have them with you for her to see." Without saying anything, he handed over a photo album. It was filled with print after print of all the things I captured while Poppy was asleep. It was all the captured moments she'd missed out on. My throat began to close. I hadn't been home. I hadn't been able to develop these in time for her. But my papa. "Thank you," I rasped, then dropped my eyes to the ground. In my peripheral vision, I saw my papa's body relax, releasing its tension. He raised his hand as if to touch my shoulder. I stilled as he did. My papa's hand paused in midair, but clearly deciding to commit, he placed his hand on my shoulder and squeezed. I closed my eyes as I felt his hand on me, and for the first time in a week, I felt like I could breathe for a second. As my papa showed me he was with me, I actually breathed. But the longer we stood there, the more I didn't know what to do. I hadn't been like this with him for so long, hadn't let him get this close. Needing to get away, unable to deal with this again, I nodded my head and went back into the room. I shut the door and sat down, the album on my lap. Mrs. Litchfield didn't ask what it was. I didn't tell her. She continued reciting her stories to Poppy until it was late. When Mrs. Litchfield had left the room, I slipped out my boots, and like I did every night, I opened the curtains and moved to lie beside Poppy. I remembered looking at the stairs. Then the next thing I knew, I felt a hand stroking over my arm. Disoriented, I blinked my eyes open, the early rays of a new day seeping into the room. I tried to clear the fog of sleep from my head. I felt hair tickling my nose and warm breath drifting across my face. Glancing up, I blinked to sleep from my eyes, and my gaze collided with the prettiest pair of green eyes I'd ever seen. My heart missed a beat, and a smile spread on Poppy's lips, her deep dimples sinking in on her pale cheeks. Lifting my head in surprise, I held her hand and whispered, "Poppy." We're going to leave it out there for today, but I hope to see you again in the next video. Bye.